Hey everybody, this is chapter 1 of Chris Arthur's book, The Dialectics of Labor. Chapter 1 is titled Alienated Labor. And it's from part 1 of the book, which is titled Marx's Theory of Alienation. So chapter 1, Alienated Labor. God damn it. All right. Introduction. In 1844, a turning point occurs in Marx's philosophical development. For the first time, he attributes fundamental ontological significance to productive activity. Forgive me, I have to get to the end notes. I hope you're enjoying this dead air. I'm sure it's really fun to listen to. Okay, come on. Okay. Footnote. Christ on the cross. I use, quote, ontology to indicate that set of fundamental categories through which the character of the social sphere is delimited and the general framework for theory construction established. I do not mean that a priori arguments establish the necessity of these categories, but I think that every research program presupposes a commitment to some ontology. For Marx's ontology, see Georg Lukács' Ontology of Social Being, Marx, published in 1972, and Carol C. Gould's book, Marx's Social Ontology, and Scott Michaels, or Michla, I don't know how to say this name, Meikle, Essentialism in the Thought of Karl Marx. And footnote. I deliberately choose this phrase rather than, quote, labor, because the latter is open to some ambiguity of interpretation, as will be seen later in this chapter. And footnote. Through material production, humanity comes to be what it is. Through the process of production, the worker realizes his potential and becomes objective to himself and his product. The worker develops his productive powers and knows himself in and through the worker's activity and his activity's result. It is important to observe that this is possible only because there exists raw material with which to work. Marx says that, quote, the worker can create nothing without nature, without the sensuous external world, end quote. Marx. It is the material in which his activity realizes itself. In the absence of any distortion of the relationship, this material production is the, quote, mediation in which the unity of man with nature is established. The category of, quote, mediation, Marx takes from Hegel, and it is essential to his work as it is to Hegel's. It is to be contrasted with, quote, immediacy. In the present case, someone who argues that man is nothing but a part of nature, a natural being subject to natural laws, is taking the position that man is in immediate unity with nature. By contrast, someone who takes a dualistic position, representing man as separate from the natural realm, developing himself spiritually, and struggling against the power of nature, latent in himself, as well as the influence of external determinants, is taking man to be immediately opposed to nature. Marx's position is much more complex. On the one hand, Marx speaks of nature as, quote, man's inorganic body, end quote, and says that, quote, he must maintain a continuing dialogue with it if he is not to die, ... for man is a part of nature, end quote. Marx. On the other hand, he says that, quote, it is in his fashioning of the objective world that man really proves himself. Through such productivity, let me repeat that. On the other hand, Marx says that, quote, it is in his fashioning of the objective world that man really proves himself, end quote. Through such productive activity, quote, nature appears as his work and his reality, end quote. Shit, I fucked that up. Quote, nature appears as his work and his reality, ... and he can therefore contemplate himself in a world he himself created, end quote. Marx. This process is characterized as, quote, objectification, end quote. Vergegenständlichung. Another important category Marx employs. In truth, man is neither passively dependent on nature, nor is man able to create his world from nothing. It is rather the case that through industry, productive activity, a dynamic relationship between man and nature is established, in which both poles are transformed. In a discussion of this problem in the German Ideology of 1846, Marx and Engels explained that, quote, the celebrated, quote, unity of man with nature, end quote, has always existed in industry, ... and so has the, quote, struggle, end quote, of man with nature, ... end quote. Marx and Engels, German Ideology. In summing up Marx's position, we may therefore refer to the relationship of man and nature as mediated, in that it is not immediately given and forever untransformed, but is one in which productive activity, interposed as a third, quote, moment, provides a principle of development, transformation, and self-transformation. On the objective side, there is the development of productive powers, which enable society to appropriate natural materials to human use with decreasing effort. On the subjective side, Marx elaborates the idea of the constitution of a, quote, wealth of human needs, end quote, and the development of the, quote, richness of ... human sensibility, a musical ear, an eye for beauty of form, in short, senses capable of human gratification, senses affirming themselves as essential powers of man, end quote. Marx. The mediation of productive activity, objectification, Marx views as ontologically fundamental to the whole social and historical development of mankind. Okay, so it's kind of hard to explain what's going on in this figure. Basically, it's like kind of like a pyramid with no line going through the bottom. At the top of the pyramid, it says productive activity. In the bottom left-hand corner of the pyramid, it says man. In the bottom right-hand corner, it says nature. On the line between man and productive activity, it says humanization, development of the wealth of needs, a wealth of needs. And on the line between nature in the bottom right-hand corner and productive activity at the top, it says development of the productive forces. Whereas idealist social ontologies try to purge social categories of the natural and biological reductionists, evacuate the social mediations, the strength of Marx's category of, quote, productive activity, end quote, relies precisely in its double determination as the linking element between the human and the natural, the ideal and the material, teleology and causality. Productive activity is at the same time both a material interchange, the combination and transformation of raw materials into goods for human consumption, and a human social process, whereby the cunning of human practice realizes its aims within the context of definite, historically determined, and transformed socioeconomic relationships. The perspective just outlined is admittedly very general, but it underpins Marx's theory of alienation as it is sketched in the well-known chapter of the 1844 manuscripts, Estranged Labor, to which we now turn. For notes on the German terms for alienation/estrangement, see appendix. The appendix. New section, Estranged Labor. Marx's 1844 manuscripts are justly famous for conceptualizing the situation of the wage laborers as one of alienation. Because the worker has no property in the means of production, his labor power is excluded from the instrument and object of production owned by another. His labor realizes itself, therefore, only through the wage contract, whereby it is alienated to the master and works in his behalf. The laborer treats his labor as a commodity. As a consequence, he has no interest in the work itself, but only in the wage. Labor does not belong to itself, but to private property. Marx comments trenchantly on the situation endured by the worker. He executes plans he does not form. He objectifies himself and his product only to have it taken from him. He produces palaces but lives in hovels. His labor creates beauty but deforms himself. The more intelligence is embodied in the design of the factory system, the more machine-like and stupefying the routine of work, so much so that the laborer faces machinery as a competitor for his place. At work, he does not feel at home. He feels himself only when he is not working. His work is not voluntary, therefore, but is forced labor. In it, the worker belongs not to himself, but to another. Marx's diagnosis of, quote, estranged labor is a complex shifting one in which he continually comes back to elaborate themes initiated earlier. Because we have before us a first draft, the presentation is not clearly organized. However, the underlying structure of Marx's thought articulates the different moments of the system of estranged relationships by mapping the alienated mediations onto the ontologically fundamental relationships already outlined. Marx's frame of reference is the relationship man, activity, nature. In his production, man works upon the naturally given object of his activity and develops himself and his powers on a corresponding basis. Marx thematizes alienation in the same dimensions. Alienating activity estranges man from the object of production and his essential human qualities. Although the active moment is the central moment, in his exposition, Marx finds it convenient to deepen the analysis in the sequence object activity man. Let me elaborate these moments. See figure 2. And again, there's another pyramid, same structure. There's no line at the bottom. It's just kind of like a line going from a bottom left-hand corner to the top center, and then down again to a bottom right-hand corner. In the bottom left-hand corner, it says self-estrangement, alienation of man from man, and in the line, and then at the top, it says alienated labor, and at the bottom right-hand, it says estrangement from nature. Between the line from self-estrangement, alienation of man from man, to alienated labor, it says asocial sociality, artificial needs. And between alienated labor and estrangement from nature, in the bottom right-hand corner, it says accumulation of capital. 1. the worker is confronted by the product of his labor as, quote, an alien object exercising power over him, end quote. Says Marx, not only does he lose the product to the capitalist, but the product sale by the capitalist reinforces the power of wealth over the laborer, and likewise nature, the basis of production, is monopolized by the propertied class and appears as, quote, an alien world inimically opposed to him, end quote. Quote, the product of labor, end quote, says Marx, quote, is the objectification, Vergegenständlichung of labor, end quote. But, given that labor is separated from labor's objective conditions of realization, namely the material and the instruments of production, by their status as private property, the objectification of labor is at the same time labor's alienation, and the outcome is the estrangement of the worker from the material basis of his existence and life activity. Two, quote, the relation of labor to the active production within the labor process, end quote, Marx says, quote, is the relation of the worker to his own activity as alien, end quote. Marx derives this aspect from the first by means of the argument that if estrangement is manifest in the result of production, this means that production itself must be alienating. Quote, the activity of alienation, the alienation of activity, end quote. The wage laborer has no satisfaction in his work and only endures it for the sake of the wage, subordinating his activity to an alien power. Quote, his self-activity, end quote, says Marx, quote, does not belong to him, end quote. Wait, what did I say? Let me repeat that. Quote, his life activity, end quote, says Marx, quote, does not belong to him, end quote. Since, for Marx, activity is the central determinant of human being, for as men express their life so they are, the alienation of labor is at the same time self-estrangement. Marx concludes, quote, here we have self-estrangement, as previously we had the estrangement of the thing, end quote. Three, quote, a strange labor, end quote, Marx says, quote, turns man's species being, end quote, into a being alien to him, into a means for his individual existence, end quote. What does Marx mean by, quote, species being, end quote? Marx explains that, quote, man is a species being, because man looks upon himself as a universal, and therefore free being, end quote. Marx. The most important species activity is, quote, productive life, end quote. It is worth quoting an extended passage in which this is thematized. Quote, the practical creation of an objective world, the fashioning of inorganic nature, is the proof that man is a conscious species being, It is true that animals also produce. Animals build nests and dwellings, like the bee, the beaver, the ant, etc. But an animal produces only what is immediately needed for itself or its young. It produces one-sidedly, while man produces universally. It produces only under the pressure of immediate physical need, while man produces even when he is free from physical need, and truly produces only in freedom from physical need. It produces only itself, while man reproduces the whole of nature. Its product belongs immediately to its physical body, while man freely confronts his product. An animal forms things only according to the standard and need of the species to which it belongs, while man knows how to produce in accordance with the standard of every species, and knows how to apply to each object its inherent standard. Hence man forms things in accordance with the laws of beauty. In fashioning the objective world, therefore, man proves himself really to be a species being. This production is his act of species life. Through it, nature appears as his work and his reality. The object of labor is therefore the objectification of the species life of man. For he duplicates himself not only intellectually in his consciousness, but actively and actually, and therefore he sees himself in the world he has created. End quote. Marx. The characteristic of human productive activity that marks it off from a merely animal mode of subsistence is its universal and creative power. A man can, quote, put his hand to anything, end quote. But the laborer subordinated to the division of labor obtains no satisfaction in his work, because the universal power of the species is realized in capitalism as the annexation of the individual to a particular set routine. The work is a mere means towards a living wage. Quote, in degrading spontaneous free activity to a means, strange labor makes man's species life a means to his physical existence, end quote. Complains Marx. In this light, Marx argues that an increase in wages, quote, would therefore be nothing but better payment for the slave, and would not win either for the worker or for labor their human status and dignity, end quote. Marx. At the same time, the social character of production takes on an asocial quality, insofar as the worker and the capitalist both depend on each other, yet are thrown into confrontation over the destiny of the product. Thus man is estranged from man. So this, in schematic outline, is Marx's account of estranged labor. We are not concerned here with thematizing other spheres of estrangement, but there is one corollary worth noting. Marx writes a special section on the estrangement involved in capitalist consumption. The significance Marx attaches to the development of, quote, the wealth of human needs, end quote, was noted briefly above. In principle, Marx regards each new product as, quote, a new enrichment of human nature, end quote. Under private property, however, this relation of production to consumption reverses its significance, for the former now dominates the latter in an alienating way, he argues. The capitalist, quote, speculates on creating a new need in another so as to drive him to fresh sacrifice, to place him in a new dependence, end quote. In this context, quote, every new product represents a new potentiality of mutual swindling, end quote. Marx. In a remarkably prescient passage, Marx diagnoses the essence of advertising. Quote, subjectively, the extension of products and needs becomes a contriving and ever-calculating subservience to inhuman, sophisticated, unnatural, and imaginary appetites, No eunuch flatters his despot more basely or uses more despicable means to stimulate his dulled capacity for pleasure than does the industrial eunuch. The producer, in order to sneak a few pieces of silver, out of the pockets of his dearly beloved neighbors in Christ. He puts himself at the service of the other's most depraved fancies, plays the pimp between him and his needs, excites in him morbid appetites, lies in wait for each of his weaknesses, all so that he can then demand the cash for this service. Let me copy this down. Sorry about that. As for the purchaser of these goodies, he is incapable of truly enjoying anything for itself, because all the senses have been estranged by private property in favor of, quote, the sense of having. Quote, the sense of having, end quote. Marx is struck above all by the quasi-magic power of money, seemingly to acquire for its possessor every human power he lacks. It is, quote, the alienated ability of mankind, end quote. Quote, it makes contradictions embrace, end quote. Marx. Sorry, I gotta get to the footnotes. Sorry. Forgive me. Sorry. Come on. Okay, we're in business here. The footnote is just a citation, so. Anyway. Of course, one could say that such a criticism of capitalist priorities and perversions is not difficult to mount. Charles Fourier, with his theory of the passions, had already connected the richness of need and enjoyment with, quote, association of labor, and inveighed against production for the sake of production. The work of Moses Hess on the category of, quote, having is explicitly cited in Marx's text. Furthermore, Marx is able to draw on the resources of literature, insofar as it depicts the system of estrangement. In the final pages of his notebook, he quotes passages from Goethe and Shakespeare in his critique of money. What is new in Marx, as we shall see, is the way in which such insights are situated in a comprehensive theory of capitalism, which grounds the necessity of communism in a real historical transition. Let us now try to get an overview of our progress so far. At the beginning, I showed that the category of, quote, productive activity has general ontological significance for Marx. Already in 1844, therefore, we have the first glimpses of the science of historical materialism, because this mediation provides the possibility of a historical dimension to human existence, insofar as men's relationships to nature and to each other are transformed through it. The actual development of this activity, however, has become subsumed under a further set of mediations. In the present economic conditions, we find that productive activity itself is mediated through the division of labor, private property, exchange, wages, in sum, a system of estrangement in which productive activity loses productive activity's self and falls under the sway of an alien power. Istvan Mesmeros has termed this, quote, a set of second order mediations, i.e. a historically specific mediation of the ontologically fundamental self-mediation of man with nature, end quote. Mesmeros, in the book Karl Marx's Theory of Alienation. 1970. The most important distinction between the two orders is that initially it is presupposed that productive activity is in immediate unity with its object, whereas with the imposition of the estranging second-order mediations, labor is immediately confronted by its object as something separate from it. This immediate opposition is not ontologically given in the nature of things, but is the result of historically determinate mediations. It is necessary to note that the categories immediate/mediate do not divide elements into two different classes. Rather, the same relation may be mediated from one point of view and immediate from another. For Marx, what requires historical explanation is not the unity but the separation of these moments through a process whereby, quote, man alienates the mediating activity itself, end quote, and hence becomes the slave of a, quote, alien mediator, end quote. Marx. It is important to understand that the emergence of the second-order mediation does not substitute itself for the first. It further mediates the mediation itself. This means that it would not be correct to erect a dichotomy between them such that everything true of one side is true of the other, a strategy typical of analytical thought. This, in turn, would facilitate a faulty diagnosis of the problem of alienation in terms of an opposition of the ideal and the real. Let us note in particular that, if through productive activity, man objectifies himself and lives in a world he has himself made, this is no less true when he alienates himself and fails to recognize himself in the system of estrangement brought about through alienated objectification. It is this conceptual inflection, rather than mutual exclusion, of the categories, quote, objectification and, quote, alienation, that permits theoretical space for grasping the objective necessity of a historical supersession, which would otherwise be a utopian, quote, demand. Equally, the possibility of historical supersession depends on a refusal to identify the second-order mediation with the first, easy to do because in recorded history, the rule of private property bulks large, thus building into the theory the inevitability of alienation, whatever philosophy may endeavor to reconcile us to it. In order to overcome estrangement, the alienating mediations must be overcome. But this does not mean that Marx rejects all mediation. For the, quote, first-order mediation, productive activity as such is an absolute ontological dimension of social life. Marx opposes only mediation's specific alienated form, imposed through second-order mediations which are historically surpassable. If this distinction is not drawn, and social philosophy collapses the two levels into one, such that private property and exchange are taken to be as absolute as productive activity itself, then it is not possible for such a philosophy to grasp the conditions of a positive supersession of estrangement. It must descend to apologetics and pseudo-solutions. New section, the concept of, quote, labor. Confusion is evident on this last point in some of the secondary literature on Marx's 1844 manuscripts. One reason for this is that Marx's terminology is not always understood. To make further progress in elucidating Marx's thought, it is necessary to deal with a point on this avoided so far. This is that the second-order alienating activity is often identified by Marx as, quote, labor, not, quote, wage labor or, quote, alienated labor, but, quote, labor pure and simple. If this category, quote, labor, Arbeit, is identified in reading the text with the productive activity as such that is ontologically fundamental, hopeless misunderstanding can arise. It need not arise if a commentator is sufficiently sensitive to the context to discount such a, quote, literal reading. However, this point on terminology needs to be grasped, not only for pedantic exactness, but also because an important conceptual point hangs on it, as will be shown below. To begin with, let us attend to the textual problem. This problem is a special case of the difficulty of reading Marx's early work through spectacles acquired by knowledge of the later work, thus imposing anachronistically the meanings of Marx's Capital on the young Marx. The category, quote, labor, Arbeit, had settled its meaning by the time Marx wrote Capital, as one of Marx's fundamental ahistorical categories. Thus, the chapter in Marx's Capital on the labor process starts with the assertion that this can be examined without reference to the social form within which it is carried on. Marx goes on, quote, labor is, first of all, a process between man and nature, a process by which man, of his own accord, mediates, regulates, and controls the metabolism between himself and nature, ... Through this movement, he acts on external nature, changing external nature, and simultaneously changes his own nature. End quote. Another quotation from Capital shows that at this time Marx equates, quote, labor with productive activity in the sense of our first order mediation, quote, labor as such, in labor's simple character as purposive activity, is related to the means of production, not in their determinate social form, but rather in their concrete substance, ... The earth is non-produced means of labor, the others as produced. End quote. Marx. Shit, there's a footnote that I missed. Quote, it is not the unity of living and active humanity with the natural inorganic conditions of their metabolic exchange with nature, and hence their appropriation of nature, which requires explanation, or is the result of a historic process, but rather the separation between these inorganic conditions of human existence and this active existence, a separation which is completely posited only in the relation of labor and capital, of wage labor and capital, end quote. Marx, Grundrisse. Sorry about that. I'm confusing myself here. The usage of the term, quote, labor is different in the early writings. In such texts as the 1844 manuscripts and The German Ideology, 1846-7, Marx restricts the term to productive activity carried on under the rule of private property. Productive activity carried on under the rule of private property. It is not the term Marx uses when he wishes to thematize that activity, which is the universal ontological ground of social life. Still less does it apply to future unalienated free activity. It is a testimony to the incapacity of people to read what is written in the 1844 text, that when Lukács takes from it the appropriate distinction, he does not use Marx's own terminology. Instead, he elevates the term, quote, Arbeit to an ahistorical universal, as in the following diagnosis, quote, in his discussion of economics, Marx, drawing on his knowledge of empirical evidence, distinguishes sharply between objectification in labor in general and the estrangement of subject and object in the capitalist form of labor, end quote. Lukács. If Lukács can overlook the point, it is not surprising that lesser thinkers do so. Thus, Herbert Marcuse, in his 1932 review of the 1844 manuscripts, speaks of, quote, Marx's positive definition of labor, end quote. And in his book, Reason and Revolution of 1941, Marcuse states that in the 1844 manuscripts, Marx holds that, quote, labor in its true form is a medium for man's true self-fulfillment, end quote. Marx. Grunder. Jesus Christ. Marcuse. Spacing out here. Wake up, buddy. Footnote. Quote, the foundations of historical materialism, end quote, quoted from Marcuse in the book From Luther to Popper, essays translated blah, blah, blah. Never mind. Wait. To cite a more recent account, Paul Watson and Andrew Gamble, in their book From Alienation to Surplus Value, published in 1972, put forward the view that Marx's, quote, ontological position, end quote, is grounded in, quote, the dialectics of labor, end quote, and they quote freely from all periods of Marx's work to establish this without noting any problems about the early terminology. End footnote. T.I. Oyserman says in his paraphrase of the 1844 manuscripts, quote, to analyze private property, one has above all to analyze the forms of labor which creates it. ... Marx ... explains that private property and everything that springs from private property is not created by labor in general, but by alienated labor. Alienated labor, a historically definite form of human activity. End quote. T.I. Oyserman. Wikipedia says Theodor Oyserman lived from 1914 to 2017 and was a Soviet, Russian philosopher and academician. Back to the text. These are examples of, quote, positive readings, which would conform with Marx's usage only if the phrase, quote, labor in general, end quote, were to be, quote, productive activity, end quote, instead. Let's now turn to some examples of, quote, negative readings. Raya Dunayevskaya, without citing exact references, says, quote, so hostile was Marx to labor under capitalism that at first he called not for the, quote, emancipation of labor, but for labor's, quote, abolition. That is why at first he termed man's function not, quote, labor, but, quote, self-activity, unquote. ... No matter how the language changed, the point remained that labor in a new society would in no manner whatever be the type of activity it is under capitalism, where man's labor is limited to the exercise of his physical labor power. End quote. Raya Dunayevskaya, Marxism and Freedom. Erich Fromm follows Dunayevskaya closely. Robert Tucker sums up the matter correctly as follows. Quote, by, quote, labor or, quote, alienated labor, terms that he employs interchangeably, Marx means productive activity performed by man in the state of alienation from himself. He declares that all human activity up to now has been labor. ... Consequently, man has never been fully himself in his creative activity. This activity has never been, quote, self-activity, by which Marx means free creativity in which a person feels thoroughly at home with himself, enjoys a sense of voluntary self-determination to action, and experiences his energies as his own. End quote. Robert Tucker, Philosophy and Myth in Karl Marx, published in 1961. There's a footnote that I missed. See Erich Fromm's Marx's Concept of Man, published in 1961. Despite the fact that this book appears under Fromm's name, It consists mostly of Baltimore's translation of Marx's 1844 manuscripts. Fromm's preface attempts to popularize Marx by characterizing him as a quote, existentialist and a quote, Zen Buddhist. End footnote. Maceros detects some ambiguity. Quote, in the manuscripts of 1844, labor is considered both in general as, quote, productive activity, the fundamental ontological determination of, quote, humanists, and in particular as having the form of capitalistic, quote, division of labor, end quote. Is in this latter form, capitalistically structured activity, that, quote, labor is the ground of all alienation, end quote. Maceros. G. Petrovich, I think it's Gajo Petrovich. I think I have a piece by this person. He's like a Yugoslavian, I believe Yugoslavian, like praxis school kind of guy. I have some pieces from the symposium on socialist humanism. I think he's in that as a piece in that. G. Petrovich detects a similar inconsistency. Quote, in the economic and philosophical manuscripts, Marx as a rule opposes, quote, labor to, quote, praxis, and explicitly describes, quote, labor as, quote, the act of alienation of practical human activity, end quote. But he is sometimes inconsistent, using, quote, labor synonymously with, quote, praxis, end quote. Gajo Petrovich. And that's from an article on praxis in Baltimore's edited volume, A Dictionary of Marxist Thought. I would not claim that Marx is absolutely consistent, but I would say that his normal usage of, quote, labor refers it to the more specific meaning, and that examples that look like the more universal sense are often simply aspects of the more specific meaning, because, as we've already explained, labor is, at the same time, productive activity. Let us now establish the textual evidence for Marx's early, quote, negative definition of, quote, labor and his anticipation of its, quote, abolition. In the first three sections of the first manuscript, it has not yet occurred to Marx to organize the material under the rubric of estrangement. His main critical category is, quote, abstraction. Capital, landed property, and workers are separated from each other, and this, quote, abstraction is, quote, fatal for the worker, end quote. Marx shows that the evidence of the political economists themselves proves this, but they do not recognize, quote, that labor itself, is harmful and pernicious, end quote, even though it follows from their own arguments. This is partly because the political economist does not consider the human being of the worker, but merely his function as a laborer, one who lives, quote, by a one-sided abstract labor, end quote. Hence, quote, in political economy, labor occurs only in the shape of the activity of earning a living, end quote. This might leave open the possibility of some other, quote, shape of labor, but in the following discussion of estrangement, Marx says more conclusively that, quote, political economy conceals the estrangement inherent in the nature of labor. Conceals the estrangement inherent in the nature of labor, end quote. Marx. In the following pages, there is a summarizing passage in which, quote, labor is equated with, quote, the act of estranging practical human activity, end quote, and in which, quote, the act of production, end quote, is said to become, quote, an alien activity, end quote, turned against the worker within, quote, the labor process, end quote. In the second manuscript, a very important passage includes the following definition, quote, within the private property relationship, there is contained latently, the production of human activity as labor, that is, an activity quite alien to itself, to man and to nature. In this passage, quote, labor is defined as productive activity transformed by the private property system into an activity alien to itself. Were it not that this is simply ignored by political economy, simply not understood, then, quote, alienated labor would be pleonasm? What the hell does that mean? The word pleonasm. Wikipedia says pleonasm is redundancy in linguistic expression, such as, quote, black darkness, quote, burning fire, quote, the man, he said, or, quote, vibrating with motion, end quote. It is manifestation of tautology by traditional rhetorical criteria. Pleonasm may also be used for emphasis or because the phrase has become established in a certain form. Tautology and pleonasm are not consistently differentiated in literature. End footnote. Or, excuse me, not end footnote. Back to the text. So, were it not that this is simply ignored by political economy, simply not understood, then, quote, alienated labor would be a pleonasm. In this sense of, quote, labor, human activity as such is distinguished from it as free activity, which harmoniously relates man and nature, the producer and the producer's object. In the third manuscript, Marx says that the history of industry presents, albeit, quote, in the form of estrangement, end quote, a, quote, open book of man's essential powers, end quote. Quote, this was not conceived in its connection with man's essential being, but only in the external relation of utility, end quote, Marx goes on. Because, quote, all human activity hitherto has been labor, end quote. That is, quote, activity estranged from itself, end quote, Marx. Here, there is a clear distinction between the positive side of the history of production, insofar as it mobilized, quote, man's essential powers, end quote, and the negative side, constituted by the forms of estrangement within which it has developed. Quote, labor is clearly assigned to the latter as, quote, activity estranged from itself, end quote. Later, in a fragment on the division of labor in civil society, the same definition of, quote, labor appears again, since, quote, labor is only an expression of human activity within alienation, end quote. When the division of labor is, quote, the estranged and alienated form of human activity as an activity of the species, end quote. Marx. A couple years later, Marx worked with Engels on another manuscript known to us as the German ideology, in which even more striking formulations occur. Marx proposes not only the end of the division of labor, for which, quote, private property is a, quote, identical expression, end quote, but also the abolition of labor. For example, quote, in all previous revolutions, the mode of activity always remained unchanged, and it was only a question of ... a new distribution of labor ... whilst the communist revolution is directed against the hitherto existing mode of activity, does away with labor ... end quote. There followed the beginnings of a further amplification, quote, the modern form of activity under the rule of ... end quote. But this was crossed out. Nevertheless, it is clear that, quote, labor is understood as an activity which is not free and falls together with private property. The, quote, abolition of labor, end quote, Aufhebung der Arbeit, is spoken of on several occasions later in this text, of which the most interesting states, quote, labor, the only connection which still links them with the productive forces and with their own existence, has lost all semblance of self-activity, and while in earlier periods the production of material life was considered a subordinate mode of self-activity, they now diverge to such an extent that material life appears as the end, and what produces this material life, labor, which is now the only possible, but as we see, negative form of self-activity, as the means, end quote. All these passages show that, quote, labor is defined as alienating activity, to be distinguished from self-activity, free activity, human activity. In all these passages also, the context makes it clear that the labor defined negatively is not productive activity itself, the manifestation of, quote, essential power, end quote, but only that carried on within the division of labor and private property. Equally, abolition of labor does not do away with work itself, not even manual work, but sets it in the framework of, quote, free and, quote, universal activity. If we want to know the immediate source of this way of talking about, quote, labor, we need look no further than Marx's own acknowledgement of the influence of Moses Hess on his thought. In the preface to the 1844 manuscripts, Marx says that, quote, the only original German works of substance in this science, end quote, include, quote, the essays by Hess published in 21 Bogen, end quote. This refers the reader to some essays by Hess in a book published abroad in 1843 to defeat the German censorship. The first of these is a review of a book by Lorenz von Stein on French socialism and communism, which made a big impact on radical circles in Germany. I know the name Lorenz von Stein. I feel like I know who this is, but I can't really think of who it is. Lorenz von Stein lived from 1815 to 1890, was a German economist, sociologist, and public administration scholar from Eckernförde. As an advisor to Meiji period Japan, Lorenz von Stein's liberal political views influenced the wording of the Constitution of the Empire of Japan, as well as major constitutional thinkers such as Rudolf von Gneist. According to Colin Gordon, Stein articulated a, quote, vision of a liberal state as active historic partner in the making of civil society, end quote, and called for, quote, a tabling of the question of class formation as part of the state's agenda, end quote. Stein advocated a combination of constitutional liberal state with a welfare state, and has been called the, quote, intellectual father of the welfare state. Stein and other Hegelian liberals such as Robert von Moll also had a profound influence on American progressivism. Back to the text. At the time he wrote the review, Hess was already in Paris, and so had first-hand knowledge of the Fourierist and other socialist currents. In Hess's review, Hess declares that in communism, quote, the opposition of enjoyment and labor disappears, end quote. This is because, quote, every man has an inclination to some kind of activity, even to very different sorts of activity, and out of the multiplicity of free human inclinations and activities arises the free, living, and ever youthful organism of free human society, free human occupations that cease to be, quote, work and become identical with, quote, pleasure, end quote. Moses Hess. I wanted to look at the German Wikipedia real quick for Moses Hess. Moses Hess lived from 1812 to 1875 and was a German Jewish philosopher and writer. He was one of the early socialists and a pioneer of Zionism. His dates of birth and death are, according to the Jewish calendar, the 4th of Shavat, 5572, and the 1st of Nisan, 5635. The life of Moses Hess can be divided into individual phases. The early years in which he identified with Judaism until the end of the 1830s, the time of transition to the leading communist intellectuals and his participation in shaping pre-revolutionary tendencies, 1840s, and finally the years of his turn to early social democracy and the formation of early Zionism, 1860s. Back to the text. There is no doubt, therefore, that in his 1844 manuscripts, Marx is writing under the immediate influence of such views. Two of the commentators we cited earlier as failing to notice that in the 1844 manuscripts, quote, labor is the term construed as a, quote, negative form of self-activity, as alienation, are yet struck by the fact that Marx calls for the, quote, abolition of labor in the German ideology, and they provide similar solutions to the problem, which will serve to introduce our own reflections on the matter. Marcuse, in his book Reason and Revolution, makes the following comment, quote, these amazing formulations in Marx's earliest writings all contain the Hegelian term Aufhebung. So, abolition also carries the meaning that a content is restored to its true form. Marx, however, envisioned the future mode of labor to be so different from the prevailing mode of labor that Marx hesitates to use the term, quote, labor to designate alike the material process of capitalist and of communist society. He uses the term, quote, labor to mean what capitalism actually understands by it in the last analysis, that activity which creates surplus value in commodity production or which, quote, produces capital, end quote. End quote. Marcuse, Reason and Revolution. Oiserman permits himself to express the view that in speaking of the abolition of labor, Marx adopts, quote, a form of expression which is not very apt terminologically, end quote, Oiserman, and he excuses it with much the same reasons as Marcuse, namely that Marx is simply barring the category of the political economist, and that in any case, quote, Aufhebung does not quite mean quote, abolition, end quote. There's a couple of footnotes here. See, Weitling. Marx also gives credit to Wilhelm Weitling and to Engels in footnote. One of the quotes is from David McClellan, The Young Hegelians, and Karl Marx. Marcuse, and footnote. Oiserman, The Making of the Marxist Philosophy. Footnote. The editors of the current English edition of the collected work simply ignore the problem and write in their preface, quote, labor will be transformed from an activity people perform under compulsion into genuine self-activity of free people, end quote. End footnote. The problem is clear. In some sense, the alienated form of activity seems to demand a distinct concept which is correlative with the other moments of the bourgeois totality, notably capital. That is, a concept which is historically specific. Sorry, let me repeat that sentence. I've got spaced out for a second, sorry. The problem is clear. In some sense, the alienated form of activity seems to demand a distinct concept which is correlative with the other moments of the bourgeois totality, notably capital. That is, a concept which is historically specific. In another sense, there is a continuity of reference when we discuss productive activity under the rule of private property and under socialism. Curiously enough, a similar terminological problem was addressed by Engels in his editorial work on Marx's Capital. In a footnote in Marx's Capital, Marx already noted that English writers of the 17th century liked to use an Anglo-Saxon word for the actual thing and a Latin word for, quote, its reflection, end quote. In a later note inserted in the fourth German editions, such a case arises when Engels overenthusiastically claims that where German just has, quote, die Arbeit, end quote, English has the advantage of two separate words for two different aspects of it. That which, quote, creates use values, ... is called, quote, work, end quote, as opposed to, quote, labor, end quote, Engels. Which, quote, creates value, ... is called, quote, labor, end quote, as opposed to, quote, work, end quote, says Engels. English usage does not accord with Engels' distinction, as expressions such as, quote, look for work, end quote, show, but the important point is that it could be useful to have two such separate expressions. There is a conceptual difference that needs to be marked between the material process of working and the inflection given to this activity when it is socially specified, within exchange as value-producing labor. It is no longer just work, but has a determinate social form which marks it out within the generic activity. Earlier I mentioned that there is a conceptual problem underlying the sense in which, quote, labor is used. This is because throughout the 1844 manuscripts, Marx continually relates labor to private property in a very intimate way, as, quote, the subjective essence of private property, end quote. Since private property is understood by Marx as a historically specific system to be superseded, it must surely follow that its essence cannot be a first-order mediation, but must be equally determined within the framework of second-order mediations. Either Marx should have said that the essence of private property is, quote, alienated labor, end quote, reserving the term, quote, labor for the ontologically prior level, or if, quote, labor as such is to be the, quote, subjective essence, end quote, then we need some other term for the relevant first-order mediation. If we take the second alternative, then a reading of Marx's 1844 manuscripts and the German ideology readily gives us a candidate, namely, quote, activity, or more precisely, quote, productive activity. Quote, labor may then be defined as, quote, alienated productive activity, end quote, or, if that is to beg the question, as, quote, activity within the relationships of private property, end quote. The next chapter investigates these private property relations. Summary. Marx's ontology comprises the complex totality of man, activity, nature. In the history of human society, the mediating moment is productive activity, but imposed on this first-order mediation is a set of second-order mediations, principally private property, estranging man from himself, man's powers, man's activity, and man's object. Objectification is then at the same time alienation. Within the system of second-order mediations, productive activity, now an alienating activity, is redefined as alienated labor. Marx's project is to conceptualize the positive supersession of this system of estrangement.